On this Saturday night, the growing list of Canadian politicians in hot water over holiday travel. A prominent member of the federal NDP is stripped of her critic role after traveling to Greece.
This is a very easy to understand and very relevant scandal.
The protest at an Ontario long-term care home.
What's happening right now is horrific.
Concern and frustration mounts as COVID case numbers and the death toll rises. The political stories that could shape 2021.
Can the government get enough Canadians vaccinated?
And a little boy receives a precious gift from his father, who died 7 years ago.
Global National with Robin Gill. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Outrage is building over an expanding list of officials flouting pandemic travel restrictions. Right now, federal public health guidance states all non-essential travel outside of Canada is to be avoided. For months, politicians have been telling everyone to stay home, and yet that hasn't stopped some of them from leaving. Seán O'Shea is following the developing details in our top story tonight.
Every time you take a trip, it puts people in jeopardy.
With hospital intensive care units at or near capacity, government leaders have pleaded.
Please, stay at home when you can.
But instead of practicing what they preach, some politicians have been escaping the Canadian winter, quietly jetting away over the holidays. Now a growing scandal in Alberta.
Someone chose to travel with rules that were in place that advised otherwise. 3
United Conservative Party politicians decided to fly the coop over Christmas for fun. Cabinet Minister Tracy Allard vacationed in Hawaii. So did Parliamentary Secretary Jeremy Nixon. The Premier's own Chief of Staff, Jamie Huckabee, went to Britain last month. But so far, none is facing discipline.
I really don't believe I can impose sanctions on individuals who did not violate the public health orders or the law.
It's just nakedly hypocritical, and that's why I think it's got such the resonant palpability that we're feeling.
In Manitoba, MP Nikki Ashton went to see her ailing grandmother in Greece, but didn't tell NDP leader Jagmeet Singh ahead of time. Ashton was stripped of her critic role as a result. But Ontario's finance minister has paid the highest price for his secret trip to St. Bart's, an exclusive island in the Caribbean. When the story got out, Ontario Premier Doug Ford expressed outrage, the next day admitting he knew shortly after Phillips arrived on the island destination.
I talked to him and asked where he was. He said he was away, so this is going to be an issue. My mistake.
Phillips was ordered home and resigned.
Significant error in judgment, a dumb mistake.
For a trip to the beach and a cheap daiquiri, he's thrown it all away.
Like some other political vacationers, Phillips used social media to make it seem like he was at home.
A very Merry Christmas.
Phillips is now a comedic punchline on social media.
We all need to do St. Bart's. Our part.
And with an air of woe is me, Calgary MP Michelle Rempel-Gardner bemoans because of politicians like Phillips, now she can't travel to the States.
I'll just be selfish and say, thanks, Rod. I don't get to see my mother-in-law now because there'll be a witch hunt if I go see my family.
'Tis the season when most of us heed the warnings to stay at home, but many closer to power do not. Seán O'Shea, Global News, Toronto.
The number of people testing positive in Ontario is growing, breaking another record today. More than 3,000 people were confirmed with the virus in the last 24 hours. The province also reported an additional 44 new deaths from COVID-19. The number of deaths from COVID-19 in a long-term care facility east of Toronto has grown to 52 residents. The story sparked another protest today outside the Tendercare Living Centre. As Morganne Campbell reports, families and advocates have been calling for additional staff and military intervention.
Kelvin Long says every day he lives in fear of a single phone call.
Should I pick it up or not? It wouldn't be any good news.
His mother is one of the dozens of residents at Toronto's Tendercare Living Centre. While she has not been diagnosed with COVID-19, others at the facility have. Since mid-December, the disease has killed more than 50 people living there and sickened over 100 more.
They helped build this country. Why are we treating them like this? It's got to stop.
I don't work in long-term care. I don't have a relative in here right now. But the thing is, this could be any one of us.
North York General Hospital took over management of the home on Christmas Day. According to Ontario's Ministry of Long-Term Care, staffing is now above levels during normal operations for personal support workers and registered staff. Infection prevention and control audits have shown significant improvement this week. Environmental services staff are on site and continue to clean the home. Right now, Ontario is experiencing nearly 200 outbreaks in long-term care homes. That is 1 in 3 facilities.
There have been multiple protests here at Tendercare over the last week. Advocacy groups and family members continue to call for not just government accountability, but military intervention.
A move the Ontario Health Coalition says is imperative as hospital resources are becoming strained due to community spread.
The staff have to come from somewhere. We cannot leave these people to starve, to go without water, to go without any respite from their pain or human contact or care.
During the speech from the throne, the Prime Minister committed to producing national standards for long-term care homes. Right now, they are not part of the Canadian Health Act, which means provinces and territories regulate facilities.
And that's something I think that is really important, to have a set of national standards and working together.
Families say that is a step toward a brighter future, but it is the present they are concerned about.
My greatest fear is my mom dying alone.
Morganne Campbell, Global News, Toronto.
In the U.S., there is growing concern over the slow rollout of the COVID vaccine. Residents in several states report long lines and being turned away as the health system struggles to keep up with the demand. Jennifer Johnson reports.
Frustration in Chattanooga, Tennessee, as people 75 years and older waited in long lines to be vaccinated against COVID-19, only to be turned away.
We were determined to get it, but unfortunately it didn't happen.
Cars were backed up in Florida and Arizona, too, where the Department of Health's website crashed, kicking eligible people out.
It took me 4 days, and I can't tell you how many tries to get through the system, because it would go through saying that there was no slots available.
Vaccinations begin in Houston this weekend for people over 65, but the city has only 750 spots for approximately 190,000 senior citizens.
I know it can be frustrating, but, we're operating with what we have, and hopefully we'll get, a lot more.
Similar struggles in Louisiana, which starts vaccinating some healthcare workers, elderly, and dialysis patients Monday.
This is going to be a limited release to start. Not everyone who is in these priority groups is going to be able to get a vaccine next week.
The U.S. has just ended its deadliest month of the pandemic and now begins what experts say will be an even deadlier January.
It's like treading water from 100 feet below the surface. You're already drowning, but you just have to keep trying because that's what you can do.
After internal oxygen systems began to buckle at 6 hospitals filled with COVID-19 patients, California's Army Corps of Engineers had to be called in to fix the problems. Medical centers across the country struggling to keep up with so many sick and dying. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
India has approved the COVID-19 vaccine developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford University. It's the first to be given the green light in that country. India is running a nationwide mock drill for vaccine delivery today. The country hopes to inoculate 300 million people in the first half of the year. India has more than 10 million COVID cases, second only to the U.S. In northern Alberta, investigators are on the scene of a fatal helicopter crash. RCMP say the chopper came down in a farmer's field about 100 kilometers northeast of Grand Prairie. The 4 occupants were confirmed dead at the scene. They are believed to be from the same family. The cause of the crash remains under investigation. 2 teenagers allegedly involved in the death of a Calgary police officer made their first court appearances today. 19-year-old Amir Abdul Rahman and a 17-year-old boy who cannot be identified because of the Youth Criminal Justice Act briefly appeared via CCTV. They're accused of murdering Sergeant Andrew Harnett. The officer died on New Year's Eve shortly after being hit by an SUV allegedly driven by those fleeing a traffic stop. Harnett's brother says he was dedicated to policing and to his community.
He was so proactive. He was the type of
police officer you'd want on the streets. You know, not waiting for crime, but looking for it and trying to prevent it. Andrew loved that city, and people are gonna miss a really good, dedicated officer.
Harnett's brother says the family hopes to hold a huge celebration of life for Andrew when it's allowed. Coming up, the year ahead in politics, why it could be a bumpy ride. From the downing of a Ukrainian passenger plane in Iran and protests over a pipeline through unceded territory in BC to, of course, the pandemic, this past year in politics has been like no other. And now we look ahead to vaccine distribution and possibly an early election in a battered economy. Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stephenson and our political correspondents take a look at the political stories expected to shape 2021.
Colleen, last year at this time, we thought that we had the busiest political year imaginable. Obviously, here we are back in the same seats a year later. We haven't stopped working since a year ago when we were last in these seats, although I will point out for everyone at home, we are 6 feet apart, those of us who are in here at the desk. We have Mike and Abigail, and at home, David joining us from the David Akin studio special, where he has spent most of the pandemic. And wow, what an incredible year. I mean, we started out with a plane crash where a plane with Canadian citizens on board was shot down. Then we went into rail blockades in some Indigenous communities. After that, COVID-19, the crash of the Stalker, the Nova Scotia shooting, crash of the Snowbirds, lost a finance minister, largest government programs in Canadian history being rolled out, a historic deficit that puts us back with the Second World War, and we're still in this pandemic. No election yet, no budget. Those are on the horizon. Mike, when you look at the year ahead in 2021, and we're all thankful that 2020 is over, but what do you see as being the dominant story this year?
I mean, it's really going to be how this government emerges from the pandemic and restarts the economy. When do they decide this is the time? This is when we're going to push the button and say, okay, we're going to start this economy firing again and making sure that Canada can reemerge from this stronger, as the Prime Minister is saying, or will it sputter out of the gate? That, I think, will be something that Canadians will want to see, because think about it. When we finally say this pandemic is over or close enough to being over that we can restart, everybody's going to want to travel, to get out, to hug each other again. People will be dying to make sure that we get going again. So when they decide, okay, this is when we can do it, I think will be the key decision for this government.
It's a huge political risk they've taken, which could either pay off tremendously if the economy restarts and bounces back, or could be a significant problem for them as they move forward. And nobody really knows yet, because we haven't seen it come out of the second wave and the full economic effects of that. But Abigail, I know one of the things that you have been looking at, not only in this pandemic, but throughout your career, has been long-term care. That was such a story of 2020, and we expect it will be again in 2021.
Well, you know, that's right. Mike talks about how the government is going to emerge from this pandemic. I'm also interested in what lessons we'll take with us from the pandemic, and long-term care is something that I'm very focused on, because, you know, the experts and the families around and involved in the system have been saying for years that these exact problems of chronic understaffing, not enough beds, multiple beds in one room, people have been sounding the alarm about those issues for years. And experts are saying that not enough was even done between the first and the second wave. So will there be big changes made to fix some of these issues going forward? That's what I'll be watching for in 2021.
And I think a lot of families will be watching for that too. And of course, all of us who one day will end up either needing that kind of health care when we're elderly, or potentially being in long-term care homes. So a personal interest in this for all Canadians as well. David Akin, I know there is something you wanted to mention that didn't happen in 2020 that normally happens that you think will be a very big story in 2021. What is that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So, of course, we didn't have a budget last year. In fact, this Trudeau government's gone longer than any government in our history in between budgets. But it looks like we're going to have one in the spring, and that's going to be very important. So that's a for certain thing we're going to happen. And then very likely we'll see a general election sometime in 2021. I think the likelihood of a general election increases as the year goes on, although it could very well be dependent on the economy. And looking back on 2020, don't forget, We had 3 provincial elections, and that's a significant story. And we saw a majority government now in place in BC, a majority government now in place in New Brunswick, continued majority in Saskatchewan. Those elections were important for themselves, but Elections Canada was keeping an eye on how they conducted those elections safely during a pandemic. Some lessons have been learned. And here's some lessons for the federal politicians. 3 incumbents, each of which were perceived by their electorate to be doing very well handling the pandemic, and they were rewarded with a majority government. I think federally that's a lesson for not just Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives, but Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. Be careful. If the public thinks the federal government is generally going the right way on the pandemic, they may reward the incumbent with a majority.
We have to take a quick pause in this conversation, but we will be back with more right after this break.
You're watching Global National.
Welcome back. 2021 election speculation, vaccine rollout, and ethical blind spots. The yearly Ottawa correspondent discussion continues now. Well, and it seems like so far the federal opposition have been pretty shy to call an election. They've been highly critical, but at the end of the day, they have backed most of the really big programs that were about direct support to Canadians. The NDP has been able to influence policy, although some say they've taken a risk because they've stepped down from taking the government to the brink. Will people just associate changes they've made to things like pharmacare and sick days with being the Liberals? Mike, how does the opposition calculate whether or not it's go time to pull the trigger and go ahead to an election in 2021?
I think it's really where we are in the pandemic and in the vaccination program, because they have to realize that whoever decides now is the time, they will be painted as that party during the election. So if the electorate says, man, I really don't want to go to the polls right now, this is more trouble than it seems, then whoever has forced them to go to the polls will pay the price. I think one of the interesting things about a possible election will be, how does Trudeau campaign? How does anybody campaign? It could be more digital, but Prime Minister Trudeau is very different from campaigning Trudeau, who rolls up the sleeves, gets out there, can whip up a crowd. If there are no crowds that he can whip up, then will he be a less effective campaigner and thus pay the price with seats in the House of Commons? That's something that I think will be really interesting.
Potential significant risk for the government, also potential opportunity. Abigail, where do you see this being the biggest opportunity for them to, I don't want to say score points, but to make gains politically with, to be fair, a government that's been pretty popular throughout this pandemic?
That's right. And I think in terms of opportunity, the vaccine rollout is a big question for me. We've seen a lot of criticism of the government for not providing answers fast enough, or not even being clear about which answers they don't have. So can the government get enough Canadians vaccinated to develop mass immunity? Can they get enough Canadians who have questions, on side, and can they physically actually get vaccines to those who need it? I think that's going to be a big question in 2021. All the experts are fast to say the vaccine is not a silver bullet, but it's the pretty much only thing in this pandemic that's given a lot of Canadians hope. So will it roll out in an effective manner? I'd say that's something to watch.
Yeah, everyone just wants to get back to their lives. David, risks the Liberals often seem to run, and we've seen it year in, year again. Some of the judgment calls they make on ethics files, and in this case as well, they've put a very large deficit out there. Do you think that that's going to continue to be a big issue, the spending without being able to answer where the money's coming from, and some of the choices that seem to be getting made on these personal ethics files, like the WE scandal and losing a finance minister?
Almost certainly, but whether or not that seems to hurt the Trudeau Liberals politically, it's an open question. I mean, again, a year ago, SNC-Lavalin, we thought it would kill Trudeau and the Liberals. Didn't. They won a government. I think as we go through the year, think about this. Minority governments fall when one of two things happens. The government thinks it can win a majority, and I don't see that right now. To win back the majority, the Trudeau Liberals would have to win a lot of bloc seats in Quebec, and none of the polls all in the last year showed that the Liberals were doing that much better in Quebec. The other way a government or an election happens is the 3 opposition parties think they can advance their own seat count. Official opposition becoming government, the other parties increasing the number of seats. Do we really think the NDP is in a position to start picking up seats? I'm not so sure. The BQ is probably at a high water mark. I don't think they're necessarily hungry. Maybe the Conservatives. But the point is, all 3 opposition parties have to come to the conclusion at the same time they can eat some government lunch. That's going to be tricky to see that calculus, I think, in the spring, maybe more so in the fall.
We have to wrap it up there, but we'll certainly be keeping a close eye on all of these issues. Thank you very much to our correspondents for all their hard work throughout the year. We'll see you back here next year. That's all the time we have for today, so back to you, Colleen.
Coming up next, a boy and a very special gift. The story that proves holiday miracles can happen. A BC boy is starting his new year with a very special gift from his dad, one that arrived 7 years after his father died. Grace Key explains how a mystery Santa made a father's wish finally come true and the little boy's Christmas very special.
9-year-old Charlie got a very special gift this Christmas from a mysterious Stephenson elf.
I figured it out by just putting my finger right there.
His father, Paul, bought this guitar 7 years ago for Charlie, but weeks before Christmas, Paul died from injuries resulting from a workplace accident.
When it came time to wrap presents, I saw this guitar and I just couldn't give it to Charlie. It was too painful.
Erica sold the guitar in a Facebook auction and doesn't remember who bought it. Paul was an amateur musician and hoped one day to teach Charlie how to play. Charlie lives with autism. He was just 2 years old when his father died.
My dad that died 7 years ago would give me this guitar to teach me how to play the guitar.
A few days before Christmas, someone wrapped the guitar and left it on the doorstep, addressed to Charlie. Not knowing what was inside, Erica put it under the tree. And then on Christmas Day, when Charlie opened it, Erica recognized it right away.
They were kind of looking at me like, why are you crying? And so I read the note to them and then looked over at Charlie, and he was sitting on the couch already playing with the guitar. Dearest Charlie, we bought it for a purpose and kept it through the years waiting for you to grow up. It was always yours.
Thank you very, very, very much. This makes me feel very happy.
Grace Key, Global News.
Sweet. And that is Global National for this Saturday. I'm Colleen Christie. Tonight's Your Canada is a sign of hope from Kamloops, BC. If you'd like to share your Canada with us, please email your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.